The first step in starting to do this bench is making some mortises. And I've got one leg already finished here, and there's 4 mortises in each leg. So they're going to be on the inside of each leg. So let's just show you how to get into that. And I'm actually going to show you how to do it 2 different ways. I'm going to use one way with the hollow chisel mortiser, the benchtop version that I have. It's not a very expensive machine. And then I'll also show you how to do it with a Forstner bit at the drill press and a chisel, because most people have a drill and a chisel, and it'll be really easy to do it that way also. So I've got the mortises laid out on these legs, and originally I had laid them out for a 1/4 inch mortise. I was finding that the mortising bit was actually bending, and I wasn't getting consistent perpendicular walls on these mortises. So I've switched to a 3/8 inch bit, and because of that, I've had to adjust where I've actually laid things out. So instead of being a 1/4 inch from the end of the leg, I'm now at 3/16, and the whole thing is 1 5/8 long, I suppose. And instead of being the 1/2 inch from the side, now I'm actually only at 7/16 from the side. And at the bottom of the leg, we are up 2 11/16 and 4 5/16 from the bottom of the leg, in case you want to know those measurements if you're looking to duplicate this project in your shop. But let's go ahead and start cutting these mortises. A really fast, easy, and accurate way to make the mortises in these legs is to use a hollow chisel mortiser. So if you have one, I highly recommend it. It's really simple to do. You just set your fence up to be the distance from the edge of the leg that you want your mortise to be, and slide your workpiece left or right until you've met up with the endpoints that you've marked off for where you want the mortise to be. After I've cut the mortise one end to the other, I like to make a series of overlapping plunges only about a 1/16 of an inch apart, so that I have minimal chisel work or cleanup to do before I can actually fit the tenon into it. And that is what you are seeing me do right here. Another way to make a mortise is to use a Forstner bit in a drill press and to come in afterwards with some chisels to clean it up. I'm basically doing the same thing that I did with the hollow chisel mortiser by setting my fence at the same distance on the drill press and just using a 3/8 of an inch Forstner bit in order to make a series of overlapping holes to start creating this mortise. To clean up these mortises from these overlapping holes on the drill press, use a bit of a wider chisel, and you're going to follow your edges of all of these scallops where they're the widest points to put the flat edge of your chisel or the back of your chisel against, just so you can square up these walls. And it isn't going to take a whole lot of pressure or effort to do this. And if you watch from the side, you can see how perpendicular you are or plumb you are quite easily. Now, you don't have to be ridiculously careful getting right on your 3/8 of an inch. The main thing is the side walls are parallel to the side of the leg and perpendicular to the face, and you can make your tenon fit it. Now, you can square off the ends as well if you like. You don't necessarily have to, but you can. And I think just for the sake of doing this video, I will square up those ends. Now, it's 3/8 of an inch wide, but I'm just going to use a nice narrow 1/4 inch chisel for this. And really, any chisel you have will do the trick. I'm just nibbling off like a 32nd at a time or so until I get right back to my marking gauge line. Next up is doing the tenons for all of the different stretchers. I've set my marking gauge up to 1 inch for the 1 inch tenon, and I'm going to actually mark it off. Even though I'm going to make these using the dado stack with the table saw, Red oak just has a bit of a tendency to want to splinter out a little bit, so I'm going to use the marking gauge just to go around all these shoulders to make sure that I get a nice crisp, clean line when I use the dado stack, because I was doing some test cuts and noticing that the shoulder was coming out very frayed, and I just don't want that to happen with the real piece. I did use a scrap in order to set the fence distance because I wanted to make sure that the outside edge of that tooth actually caught the exact edge of where the shoulder is going to be, where I made that marking gauge line. So I did play with that a little bit, but now that I'm right on it, I can go ahead and make my cuts. I'm only going to do the two faces because they're at a bit of a different depth than what the ends or the sides, whatever you want to call these two sides here, are going to be. So we'll reset the height of the dado shortly, but for now, let's just do the faces. Before somebody jumps all over me in the comments about butting the workpiece up to the fence, it is 100% safe because you're not cutting through the workpiece. If I was cutting all the way through the workpiece, I would never do this. Then we're going to reset the height of this dado stack down to 3/16 of an inch, and that will give us the height of the other one. That looks pretty good. Lock that in place. So we're just going to take these tenons down to fit them into each one of the mortises using the router plane. And red oak isn't the easiest wood to do this with because it kind of splinters and tears. So you need to take some fairly light passes in general. And I like to just fit one individually so that I don't lose track of what I'm doing. I find if I really skew the router plane on quite an angle, it doesn't splinter the red oak quite as much as going completely perpendicular across the grain. And as you go, you can just start to test fit these. We're not quite there, but not too far off either. Might go just a tiny bit more than that. That's a little too tight maybe. Now, I'm not going to take any off the other side just to make sure I don't make it too loose possibly. And I took so little off that it's probably a good thing I didn't, because it actually is about the right thickness as is. In order to make these tenons go into the mortises a little easier, I'm just going to knock off the corners of these tenons with a chisel. They do go in pretty easy right now as is, but I don't want to run into any surprises once I actually go and put glue on them. And then the other thing I like to do with tenons is just knock off the corners around the top with a bit of a chamfer. And that's just going to make it not bottom out on any debris that might be trapped inside the bottom of the mortise. You know, just a half a dozen passes is about all you need there. Now that we've got all these tenons fit into the mortises, I went ahead and laid out all of the places where the shoe rack slats are going to be. They are 1.5 inches wide and they're spaced a 1/2 inch apart, and they're 1/4 of an inch in from the edges or the ends of where the shoulders are on these tenons. So let's head over to the mortiser and get all these cut out. Well, if you've made it this far into my video, it means you're enjoying what you're seeing. So if you're not already subscribed, you should probably subscribe to my channel and give me a thumbs up to let me know you like the video. Now that we've got those mortises all cut, the next step is to maybe just clean them up a tiny bit. I don't think it's going to take very much at all, but we can just make sure that they are to their full depth, even though we made several kind of cleanup passes with the hollow chisel mortiser. We can just make sure that we're in a good spot with these here as well. and it won't take very long. And working with hand tools is actually a lot of fun. If you've never done it, I highly recommend you give it a try. Maybe even leave me a comment down in the comments section to let me know what you think about using hand tools, or if you have possibly a faster, better way of making these mortises for a bunch of slats, like a shoe rack on this bench here, or anything similar. I thought this would be a good time to make the slats for the shoe racks, so I took some 4/4 stock and I resawed it to a 1/2 inch thick. When I was done doing that, I planed it down to be 3/8 of an inch thick so that it would fit into the mortises I made with that same 3/8 of an inch chisel in the hollow chisel mortiser that matches up with the same mortises in the legs. And I did this on purpose so that I didn't have to do any extra setup with any of the machines to use a different sized chisel in that hollow chisel mortiser. Once that was done, it was a cinch to run them through the table saw and rip them to the required width. Notice how I'm using a push block for this because there's not a lot of room between the fence and the blade, and I'm also using a push block that has a lot of reference surface on the bottom of it, and that's going to prevent that workpiece from flying back up in your face. I cringe every time I see somebody on YouTube using one of those long plastic bird's mouth type push sticks because although it keeps your fingers safely away from the blade, it offers absolutely no insurance to prevent the workpiece from flying up off the table on the far side where you're not even holding onto it whatsoever. Before I began cross-cutting all these shoe rack slats, I actually did a dry assembly of the bench so that I could get a good measurement for just how long to cross-cut them. You'll also notice that I'm using a sacrificial piece here to prevent the breakout or the tear out on the exiting side of this cut. If you've watched any of my other videos, you can probably figure out that I'm somewhat of a perfectionist. It's kind of one of my fatal flaws, I think, and I can certainly run into analysis paralysis sometimes. And because of that, I thought that I would try and make all of the stretcher pieces identical in their curves, so I made this jig. It allows me to clamp in both the short rails on one side of the jig and the long rails on the other so that I could make a very consistent curve using a pencil and then cut it out on the bandsaw so that I'd be able to mount the pieces back in the jig and then use a pattern bit in the router in order to get them all identical. The other good thing about making a pattern or a jig like this is if you ever do plan on making additional projects, as I do in this case, you'll be able to remake those components very fast and easy. And that's all there is to it to get perfect matched parts, and they're all the same. Just use a pattern. Now the last thing I want to do is just ease all of these edges that you might actually grab with your hand when you're moving the bench, and just ease them with a chamfer bit. So I've got that into the router. It's going to end up being about a 1/16 of an inch chamfer, maybe a slight amount more. I never really measured it. I just kind of set it up into the router as is. So we'll do that on all of the edges except for these top edges where the seat is actually going to go. So let's get to it. It only takes a few moments to create these chamfers by using a bearing guided chamfer bit in the router table, and while you're at it, chamfer the bottoms of each of the legs on all four sides so that if somebody slides the bench around on a floor, it doesn't splinter the leg up the length of it. After I applied the finish to some of these bench components, I decided I wanted to maybe add a little bit of a contrasting dowel through each of these mortise and tenons. So I've got the drill press set up with the fence in a very good spot to do this, as well as a couple stop blocks. So rather than having to reset that fence all the time, what I've went ahead and done is I've created a spacer block here, and it just goes up against the fence, and now I don't have to move it, and I can drill the ones at the tops of these legs.
Anytime you're making a table or a chair or a bench like I am, it's always easiest to glue the end assemblies together first before you try to attach all the middle pieces. So that's what I'm doing here. The dowels are going to hold these joints together very well without having to put any clamps on it, but I did notice a little bit of discrepancy in the shoulders where they butted up to the legs, so I did end up clamping them to make sure that they stayed pulled together nice and tight. In order to simplify the glue up, I decided not to glue any of the shoe rack slats into those lower rails. It was a little bit tricky trying to hold the two rails together, pinching all the slats so they didn't fall out before I dropped them into the legs, but luckily for me, none of them fell out in the process, or at least that's what I'm going to tell you.
These clamps really probably aren't doing a whole lot of anything because those dowels are holding things together, but I do want to make sure that the joints come tight for all these mortise and tenons, and I do believe when I put these on, it is tightening up a little bit more than just how those dowels are on there. Next up is putting the upholstery on the seat for this bench, and I'm going to use some 1-inch thick Dacron for it. It's a polyester fill that is used for upholstery, and what we're going to do is allow approximately 6 inches of extra material. We'll cut off the excess later, but that allows 2 3/4 of an inch, or roughly say 3 inches for the thickness of the seat, and a few inches to be able to staple it. And like I say, we'll trim it off later. The way we're going to cut this is we're going to follow my diagram, and we're going to basically remove all of the shaded area that's here. And hopefully that's going to show up on camera. But we're going to remove all that shaded area. The bench itself, or the thickness of the foam, is 2 3/4 of an inch when you factor in the 3/4 of an inch plywood backer that we're going to use. So we're going to draw some additional marks on here, and essentially we're going to work on a 45-degree angle here. So somewhere along in here we're going to be removing basically all of this in order for this to fold nice and neatly around the corners. We're only going to make some cuts in a few places here, but let's kind of get this going so that this works. So we'll cut up here all the way to our line right there. And the same here, we'll cut all the way up to our line. This line here is the one I mean, the top one, because that's right in line with the foam. Now, we do want to remove this piece, so we can get rid of it right now. And we do want to remove all of this on the one side, but essentially this is going to wrap like so. And we want to be able to have a 45-degree angle here, which is that one that we've drawn on there. And I'm going to assume that it's in the right place, so we'll just cut it right off. I estimated that 45-degree angle. It's not exact, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think you get the idea there. And then we'll wrap the other side up and over, and we'll have a nice fold here, and we'll be able to tuck this in and staple it so that we get a nice finished edge. And then we'll go ahead and do the same kind of a thing with the fabric once we get to that stage. I did go ahead and mark the other corners so I know where to make the cuts once we get there, but let's start to wrap this first, because every video that I've seen on this type of thing talks about getting the actual
Dacron in place first before you deal with the corners. The same with the material that you're going to use also. So I'm only going to keep it about a 1/2 inch from the edge. And then similarly the ends, you want to get the ends in place as well. I do think we're close to this line that I made here on a 45 already, so we're going to cut right on it. See how close we actually are. Actually, that's pretty much right on where we need to be. And by doing this, you keep this level all the same so that you haven't got a big bunch or a big bulge like a little mountain peak in there somewhere. Now, because you've got this extra bit of thickness here, you may want to add some extra tension. Look at this line and make sure that it's nice and straight. Now, I'm not certain, but maybe before I'm completely finished with this, I might trim this little peak off of the side here. We'll see how that looks once the fabric goes on after, but for now, that's kind of got this corner finished, and we'll do the same to the other 3. Now that we've got all the corners finished, we'll just go around and trim off the excess, and I'm just going to keep it about a 1/2 inch inside all of these staples all the way around. And there you have it. I went ahead off camera and I drew a center line on my fabric, both on the long end and on the short side here, so that I would be able to know exactly where the middle is. This fabric has a bit of a linear pattern to it, and I want to make sure that those lines stay very perpendicular to the front and back edges of this bench. I also went ahead and drew some other reference lines on the back of the material, similar to how I've done the lines that would have been on the fiber fill or the Dacron, and I'm just got those on there more for reference more than anything, as well as some lines on the back of this plywood so that I'll be able to get the tension the same all the way along it. So I'm trying to stretch things right to this one pencil line here just to keep things nice and even. Now, in order to get these staples at a set distance from the edge, I've actually drawn on a little black Sharpie line on my stapler, which is going to go right along the edge of the upholstery so that I can keep these staples in a nice straight, neat line. Not necessary, but I just want those staples to be away from where the stretchers are so they don't lay on them. I'm going to try and demonstrate how to fold a corner on this seat. And I was using a YouTube video that I'll put a link in the description down below so that you can follow that video because it's really good. They talked about putting a 45-degree line on the corner of your workpiece or your base so that you could use that to kind of work towards and cut material away so that you're not having too much bulk and making this corner thick so that it sits up on like the leg of the bench when you're all finished. Cut down close to your corner, not all the way into your corner, then you'll have a pretty good start on being able to fold this corner. And I'm going to stop just maybe a 1/2 inch before the actual end of the plywood backing board for this seat. The other thing they were talking about was taking your material and kind of getting a nice fold in it so that it's going all the way up along the edge like this. And at about a 1/2 inch from that fold, you want to cut straight down parallel to that fold. Now I'm going to go maybe a little bit more than that so that I'm away from it, just because they recommend doing this in stages so that you don't cut away too much material and kind of end up behind the 8-ball before you're all finished. Sometimes just doing things in little small stages can be a humongous help. And I'm going to just come in here and cut like so. And because we've got that cut pretty close to this 45-degree line, I think I'm going to staple it down in that position just to start holding it in place so that I actually can have an easier time finishing this up. I'm trying to keep a nice straight line along the edge here.
Now the next thing you got to do is fold this over. And once again, you got to remove some of this excess material because it's just going to get in the way and add bulk. Start to work this. Now we're going to want this to come up obviously inside of that plywood, not way inside. You want it to be making a fold right along the corner as best you can. It just takes a few repositions here and there in order to get that to go where you want it to go. And a bit of folding and tucking with your finger in that corner. So let's tack that down and see what it looks like. So the last thing you have to do is try to get rid of these wrinkles and folds and so on. You just got to kind of work at it and try and pull it in such a way that you can eliminate those folds and try and keep a straight line along the side. And that's why we drew some pencil lines on the back of this seat originally. But as you work that, you will find a spot where that material just almost wants to go and lay on its own. Good, so I think that's got it.
With the upholstery all done, the last thing to do was to cut off the excess length of those dowels and then trim them off with a really sharp chisel. Once that was done, I applied another coat of polyurethane to the whole project and delivered it.
Isn't that lovely? Did you want to sit on it?
I'm gonna when I put my shoes on to leave.
Oh.
Just like it says in the title or the thumbnail for this video, this client didn't pay me a penny, but that's okay. I really enjoy seeing the look on people's faces when I give them projects I've built, especially when that client is my own mother. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video, and until next time, go build something beautiful.